Okay. Okay, so I've got 20 minutes to go through a brief history of money. I should start by saying a little bit about who I am and what I do and where I'm coming from. I'm a money manager based in Zurich for an investment office there. We do a whole bunch of different things. We do we do private equity stuff, we do private credit, we do real estate, and we do very, very vanilla liquid stuff. We do very, very exotic liquid stuff. But what we do is very, very much old finance, all right? So my whole kind of background is the kind of traditional money management, banking. It's very, very much old finance. It's the kind of stuff that you guys are all trying to disrupt. So I'm not really a crypto guy, right? I'm certainly not a crypto expert, but something that I have always been interested in has been money. What I really wanted to talk about, I know that there's an incredible vibrancy, there's a lot of excitement about cryptocurrencies, about blockchain, and understandably, because it's very new, it's very shiny, it's very interesting. But one of the things that's really kind of striking to me has been very interesting to me is that a lot of these kind of narratives around cryptocurrency and around blockchain, a lot of the hype, some of the suspicion, some of the problems that you guys are facing, some of the problems that you guys are trying to solve, they're really actually quite old problems, right? They're very, very familiar problems. And as I said, one of the things that's been striking to me is just how much of an echo you can hear in a lot of the kind of debate within various kind of crypto communities, how much that echoes past discussions and past developments. And so that's actually what I wanted to kind of talk about here this morning. Partly because it's, because it's kind of interesting, and partly because I think, the context can be useful, right? There's an argument that says a lot of these problems, they're actually kind of intractable, right? You'll see what I mean when we come. Some kind of insight into where this technology can go, right? And what needs to be done to give it a bright future. So that's the kind of idea. As I said, we'll start off with, I think, a kind of very central idea about money and about the history of money, which is that it has always been tech-driven, right? It's always been an evolution. It's always been an evolutionary story, and it's always been technology-driven, right? In that sense, Bitcoin is not in that sense. This chart shows, really, this is the history of civilization, right? So 10,000 BC, there's not that many people on the planet. We go right up to today, and you've got over 7 billion people on the planet. And what I've actually done, I've just put, it's probably a little bit too small to read, but I've put some kind of monetary milestones, some monetary and technological milestones along the way. And the first one you can see is 3100 BC, which is writing, right? The technology of writing. Now, where did writing come from? Why did writing evolve? Why was it developed? And the answer was we needed to write because we needed to track inventory, okay? It wasn't because we needed poetry. It's because we needed to keep a record of where stuff was being kept and who owned it. Where was the grain being stored? Because we've had the kind of the Paleolithic revolution here, right? The agricultural revolution. We're now basically a land-based, agricultural-based, grain-based society. Where do you store the grain, right? Who owns the grain? If someone buys the grain, how do we know that they've just bought the grain? What did they buy it for? What price did they pay? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, this was the very first ledger technology. Okay. This is where writing came from, not because of a need for poetry, but for a need for a ledger. And from this technology, lots of other things grew, right? So here, 1700 BC, you actually have the first ever derivatives contract, which is actually on display in the British Museum, right? 1700 BC from Babylon under Hammurabi, and it specifies the delivery of a commodity, a specified amount of this commodity on a particular date for a particular price. Okay, in other words, it's a futures contract, right? Now the commodity It's actually a very interesting question. Can anyone guess what the underlying commodity of this futures contract was? Grain? Okay, it's not grain. The answer is actually slaves. Right? So it was a delivery of a consignment of slaves. Right? Not joking. So there's a very, very first derivatives contract. Around about the same time, you get deposit banking. Right? So you can go and put your grain in some kind of warehouse, some kind of depository, and you get some kind of receipt for this. You can then use that receipt to buy stuff from other people, right? The depository institution, which takes all these deposits, also then lends those deposits, right? So you start to see the early stages of banking, right? Of fractional reserve banking. And by the way, this is largely grain-based, but also hides, stuff like that. This is long before we've got any coins, right? So we have a kind of reasonably the basics of a kind of modern financial system before we've even got coins, right? Before we've really even got metal. But this comes from the first ledger technology, which is writing, okay? You start to see metal being used around about this time, but not coins, right? So the use of metal, it would have been, you might buy or sell some slaves for a lump of metal, a lump of silver, right? And you would have the kind of, a specialist would cut off a lump of silver and he'd weigh it, and that weight would determine how much he was paying or receiving for the produce, right? This obviously relied on mining technology. You couldn't use metal, really, without mining technology. So the use of metal becomes actually bleeding edge technology. About here, about 700 BC, 600 BC, you get the very first coins, right? You get gold coins, you get silver coins, which are produced out of ancient, modern-day Turkey, right? But ancient Greece. And again, this also requires a certain technological breakthrough. You need to figure out how to separate silver from lead, right? And gold from electrum, okay? So there's a kind of breakthrough in metallurgy, which allows for the growth of coins. And then the growth of coins, it spreads across the continent and ushers in a period of quite sustained economic growth. Now, around about 800, you get the first paper money, right, which comes in China, and actually also the first hyperinflation. What allowed for the creation of paper money? And the answer is movable type, right, printing technology, right? And now China's a very interesting case because they historically developed lots of technologies and none of them ever really took off. But it really takes off in Europe, right, during the Gutenberg innovation, right? So kind of 1600s, 1600 Europe, you get the growth of printing, the dispersion of this printing technology, the dispersion of movable type, and now you get the growth of paper money, right? So again, this is at the kind of, we could kind of go on and on and on. 1946, you get the first credit card, right? You couldn't have credit card without plastic. So again, you've got this kind of new technological development. 2008, we have Bitcoin. Obviously, you couldn't have Bitcoin. You know the deal. So, as I said, on a very fundamental level, the innovation of money, the innovation of finance is always technologically driven. And in that sense, the fact that blockchain technology and cryptocurrencies are also very, very kind of bleeding edge technology, this is completely consistent with the history of money. So that's that out of the way. Something else which has been very interesting to me has been this kind of argument that Bitcoin's not money, Ether's not money, these things are not money, right? And there's a kind of controversy because obviously some people think that they are money and other people think that they're not money. This is also something that really is not actually new. I should start by saying it's actually a very nebulous idea, the notion of money. And to give you an example, see if you can spot the odd one out here. So we've got rusty nails, cows, cigarettes, underpants. I think it's kind of obvious, but would anyone like to guess what the odd one out is? Because it's never been money, as far as I'm aware, right? Yeah, you never know. Cigarettes are still used today, and not sure I want to, actually. So cigarettes used today in prisons, historically in prisons and labour camps. Cattle, actually, believe it or not, one of the earliest forms of money, but still used today. You could go to South Sudan, should you want to. You could actually buy property for some calves if you fancy some kind of South Sudanese real estate. Then this is acceptable tender, right? So this is money. Nails. These were used in ancient Athens before they actually had coins. They would use nails. Underpants again. Your friends notwithstanding, I don't think this is currency. The point I'm making is, when you say to someone, "Oh, that's not money," well, it's almost kind of subjective. If someone wants to accept it as money, there are enough people out there who accept it as money, then it's money. Full stop, right? And that's it. Right? Now, this is kind of interesting because it has to. So, is Bitcoin money? Yes, because people accept it as money. People take it as money, right? People use it as money. Therefore, it's money. Now, you may say, is it good money? That's a different question. Right? But of course it's money. How do you make it a better money? You have to make it much easier to use, right? And I guess that's a separate conversation. There's lots of ways it could be easier to use, but of course it's money. Now, I think a lot of people whose opinions should be credible, Axel Weber, the UBS CEO, Paul Krugman, Nobel Prize-winning economist, who said Bitcoin is evil, actually, a little bit extreme. Larry Kudlow, again, White House advisor. These opinions should be credible. They're all kind of unanimous in the idea that Bitcoin is not money, absolutely not money. But in terms of the theme of what I'm talking about, this is not new. Remember that paper money was once very novel, right? It was a very strange idea to use paper as money, especially unbacked paper. And one of the things that happened in colonial America, when it was still a part of the British Empire, there was a real shortage of metal. There was a shortage of good money. People were using hides, they were using grains, they were using livestock. And one of the ideas was that, why don't we just use paper? Right, we don't have to back it with anything. We can just use paper as money in America. And there was a kind of hearing on this. And here you see a quote from a guy called Paul Dudley, who was the Attorney General of Massachusetts, 1714. He said, "Money founded on pure fiat must alter and destroy the very nature of money." Right? So very deep suspicion about the idea of unbacked paper for money, which is that's basically what the system that we operate under today, and it kind of seems to be just about okay, right? It's not perfect, right, but it's okay. In 1840, over 100 years later, exactly this kind of same argument. At this point, this is actually a discussion in the House of Parliament in London about whether or not, about the monetary system and the extent to which Bank of England money should be backed by gold. Again, the idea of not backing it by gold was anathema, right? Because paper currency had no intrinsic value, right? So paper currency was viewed with very, very deep suspicion not so long ago, right? This was a newfangled innovation. People didn't trust it, right? Today it's the opposite, right? Today the idea that gold is money is something that people really, really hate. This is actually just an extract from an exchange between Ron Paul and Ben Bernanke, who was then chairman of the Federal Reserve. Ron Paul says, "Is gold money?" Ben Bernanke says, "No. It's definitely not money. It's an asset, but it's definitely not money." Again, just to kind of emphasize, these ideas are nebulous, these things change. So what's the point? The point is, I think there's probably better uses of your time than trying to convince someone that Bitcoin or cryptocurrency is money, or that it's not money, right? And this is an intractable, age-old debate, and you're not going to settle it. Okay, a bit more kind of poignantly, money issuers of currency have always resorted to quite extreme measures when their power to issue currency has been threatened, right? And often they've resorted to extreme violence, right? And a good way to see this is to think about the historical treatment of counterfeiters, right? In other words, counterfeiters historically, people who are issuing currency without the permission of the state, right? Now you go back to Roman times, and you can see here from the statutes from 81 BC, the treatment that was meted out to people who were found guilty of counterfeiting gold or silver money, or even refusing money that was stamped with the face of the emperor. Now, if they were members of the elite, they would be sent to an island. If they were members of the lower classes, they would be condemned to the mines, which wasn't a very pleasant way to die, because inevitably that's what it was. If you're a slave, then you were punished capitally, i.e. you were executed, right? So very little tolerance for people issuing currency without the state's permission in Roman times. And by the way, something else, which we'll come on to in a moment, note the kind of complete injustice and inequality of the treatment of these people, right, by class, right? I said, we'll talk about inequality and kind of distributions in a moment, but this is an age-old problem, right? This is an age-old problem. If we kind of fast forward a little bit in time to medieval England now, and we get to the reign of King Henry I. King Henry I has not gone down as one of England's great kings for a number of reasons, but one of the things he oversaw was quite a grotesque debasement of the currency. And in particular, he really blamed the mint masters. The mint masters were in those days, you would basically have a bunch of mints dotted around the country to kind of to supply money to the key regions, right? And these were the masters of the mint. King Edward was very, very irritated with his mint masters because they were overproducing without his permission, right? He'd lost control of the money supply because these mint masters were just producing more and more metal despite him not wanting them to. So what did he do? And they were getting very rich out of this. They were doing very well out of this. So what he did, 1124, he summons them all down to Winchester, which is the capital of England in those days. And this is Christmas Day, for nice spot Christmas lunch. And he shows how unhappy he is with the mint masters by cutting off their right hand, as you can see here, and depriving them of their testicles, because they were all men, obviously. So this is quite a kind of brutal punishment for someone who's doing something which seems quite innocuous, right? And I said there are countless examples of this type of aggression and this type of behaviour by the state, protecting its power, protecting its privilege that it has to produce legal tender, right? And it's a very obvious explanation as to why, right? Because the ability to produce money, the ability to produce currency, is a phenomenal power. Arguably, it's the ultimate power, right? Because it's a claim on resources. You don't have to raise tax, you don't have to raise VAT, you don't have to go through Parliament, you just print the money. And now you print money, you give it to yourself, now you can buy stuff, right? So this is just a phenomenal power which they guard jealously, okay? It's not that they're necessarily concerned with the debasement of money, it's that if anyone's going to debase the money, it's going to be them, right? It's not going to be anyone else. No one else is allowed to issue currency. And I think maybe the best illustration of the power is actually the use of printed money. Economists call it seigniorage. The use of seigniorage to wage war, right? And historically, this is where all debasements have really come from. Not all of them, but many of them. And again, just as a sample, this chart here shows it's the level of the U.S. consumer prices going back to the late 18th century. And what you can see, there's generally an upward trajectory, so i.e. an inflation, but you can see these kind of spikes of the CPI here. This is a log scale. These spikes here, 1812, the 1860s, First World War, Second World War, Vietnam. You get these very sudden spikes because one of the ways the government got enough resources to pay for its military, to pay for its war machine, was to print the money. And as I said, this is just a US example. There are countless examples. Germany is a spectacular one in the First World War. And the very first episodes of inflation actually are ancient Greece and ancient Rome during the wars with Persia and during the Punic Wars with Carthage, right? It has always been a way to get money to go to war, right? And this is ultimately the absolute power of the state to wage war. And this is kind of what you're screwing around with. If you're actually saying, well, we can disrupt government money, we can issue our own money, this is kind of what you're up against, right? Ken Rogoff, I think Harvard economist, he was asked about the current status of regulation in cryptocurrency, and his view was that because and a lot of advocates were saying, it looks as if we've got a good balance now with regulators. We've got a good dialogue, a good understanding with each other. Rogoff's view was this hasn't even started yet. The reason why the regulators are allowing this to happen is because, and governments are allowing this to happen, is because it's so small. It's just not consequential. If it ever is to become large and consequential, you will feel the full might of their wrath. Now, whether he's right or not, I don't know. It would be nice to think we live in more enlightened times, right? But the idea of actually having a dialogue with regulators, getting the regulators on side, getting them to understand what we do, this is unambiguously a very, very good thing, right? So that's that. The next thing, I spoke earlier about inequality. And I know that decentralization is the kind of buzzword. It's more than a buzzword. It's absolutely, it's a kind of fundamental concept to the notion of the whole community and the technology. And by the way, I'm a very big believer in decentralization. Right? We live in Switzerland. You can see how powerful distributed political power is. Decentralization is a very, very good thing. However, there is a problem, right? And the problem is historically, and actually in the present, you don't really get uniform distributions, right? You get very uneven distributions. So here is a chart which shows the distribution of wealth, right? And the way to read these kind of dots. So this is the number of households. This is the percentage of wealth. You can see here. So here in these countries, 50% of households have about 5% of the wealth, right? And it obviously gets more extreme as you go up here, right? 80% of households only actually have 40% of wealth, which means 20 have 60, etc. So it follows a power law. Where does this data come from? Well, this is ancient Athens. This is what economic historians spend their time doing, gathering this kind of data. We've got ancient Athens. We've got Florence, 15th century Florence. And we've got the USA just after the Second World War. And you can see these, you calculate a Gini coefficient from these, and you can see actually that these kind of shapes, these curves actually kind of look the same, right? Even though some of them are 2,000 years old, right? Now, if you had a completely decentralized distribution of wealth and a completely uniform, it would be on this 45-degree line, right? But we're not, and we never are, and we never have been, right? And I personally think that we can't. Right? Now, people have tried to get onto this line, but it's never worked. Because what you've actually ended up with is just a concentration of something else, right? So you try and level out the wealth, and what you get is a concentration of power, right? So, for example, in the Soviet Union, it's all in one person. In China, it's all been in one person, right? So you get, in North Korea, it's all basically in one person. So you might have a much more even distribution of wealth, but you've got a very uneven distribution of power. As I said, this is seems to be something fundamental about the distribution of money, and of course we see the same thing today in Bitcoin. Now I know that the data is not perfect in Bitcoin for reasons that you'll probably be familiar with, but the distribution the shape of the curve is kind of the same. This is the distribution of Bitcoin by wallet, right? Now, what's the point of this? Well, I guess there are 2 points. On a kind of higher level, there is a kind of raging debate about inequality and the need to do something about inequality. And without actually, saying whether or not this is a problem or we should do without kind of expressing any opinion, I just point out that actually it seems to be quite a difficult problem. It's quite an intractable problem. It's a problem that no one's ever solved, right? So I think it's when you're kind of listening to this discussion, listening to this debate, I think it's very interesting to think, okay, why is that going to help? In what way is that going to help? Why hasn't it helped in the past? There seems to be something fundamental about this, right? What is so fundamental about it? I think it's a very interesting question. And the simple answer is I don't know, right? But I think it's probably something to do with the physics of information. But in terms of kind of cryptocurrency and Bitcoin, I think there's a very fundamental point here, which is that the kind of notion that decentralization is always and everywhere a good thing, well, I think it can't be true, right? It can't be true. Now, we know that too much centralization is a bad thing. Too much decentralization just becomes untractable, and it seems not to persist anyway. Where's the right kind of level in between? Again, I don't really know. I think that, but I do know that where decentralization, I think, is a very, very good principle, it might not be a great rule, okay? And just kind of imposing it on everything, I think, is just going to lead you down. It's going to, you're going to end up with problems, and ultimately, you're not going to be successful at solving the problem that you're trying to solve. So I'm going to finish up with one last thing, something, again, we'll all be familiar with. We've just seen a hell of a fever in 2017 with cryptocurrency, just as big a crash in 2018. this is not actually something that is new either. Here's a chart here, which doesn't look too dissimilar from the Bitcoin chart that everyone's familiar with. It's actually the share prices of the South Sea Company from the 1720s. It was probably the first global stock market crisis, because this was a global stock market crisis. Now, one of the things that I think is interesting, I did say the history of money from metal to Melon. One of the things that I think is very interesting, speculation is just it's a part of who we are. It's just a fundamental aspect of the human condition, right? You're not going to eliminate speculation, right? But one thing you can do, I think, is you can eliminate the link between speculative collapses and economic collapses, right? Why should a collapse in a financial asset lead to a collapse in the economy, right? When the Bitcoin bubble burst, when the crypto bubble burst, it didn't lead to a collapse in economic activity. Right? When the NASDAQ bubble burst, it didn't actually lead to a collapse in economic activity. Right? When the credit bubble burst in 2008, it nearly led to a global economic meltdown. And 2008 was just the latest in a whole bunch, right? You can go back to the 19th century, the 18th century, and you see very, very similar kind of situations. Why? Because the banking system is fundamentally unstable. It's fundamentally unstable because it basically borrows money very, very short term. It deposits short-term paper, and it buys assets which are very, very long-term, right? So it has a maturity mismatch, right? So if everyone wants to get the money back that they deposited in the bank, the money's not there, right? It's tied up in 30-year mortgages or tied up in 10-year loans, right? You kind of have to wait, and obviously you don't wait. So what happens is the bank then becomes a forced seller of those assets, the things that it can, crashes the price of those assets, stops giving new credit to the economy, and this is how you get these economic recessions or even economic depressions, but always driven by this maturity mismatch. And I think one of the exciting things for me on Melon, I know Mona's talked all about the disrupting the back end and the plumbing of finance, but you can, in a tokenized world, you should be able to put anything into a Melon fund, including bank loans. So why couldn't banks ultimately be putting their own loans? It doesn't have to be stocks and shares or commodities. It can actually be bank loans. Now, you put bank loans into a Melon token, right? You issue a bunch of those bank loans as a token, right? The tokens can expire in kind of 3 years to match the duration of the loans, right? So if you have 10-year mortgages or 15-year mortgages, it can be a 10-year token or a 15-year token, right, et cetera, et cetera. There's no maturity mismatch. For the investor in those bank loans, you've got something that's liquid, you've got a token, right? So you can't actually just use that as money, you can use that as currency, right? And again, this has actually been seen before, this kind of whole bills of exchange system, right? But that's one of the things that this technology can potentially do, and that is a real thing, right? Because if you actually are eliminating, you won't eliminate economic cycles, but you could potentially eliminate depressions, you can eliminate very, very deep recessions, you can eliminate the kind of crash that we saw in 2008, right? Which I think is a very, very big thing and a very, very exciting thing. But that's, anyway, that's what I think. I have to read this disclaimer, by the way. My lawyer said I had to read it out. And it basically just says that you shouldn't believe anything I said. And it wasn't investment advice. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.